In the autumn of 1428, when the world seemed determined to drown France in English blood, a 17-year-old peasant girl stood before the gates of Vaucouleurs with a claim so audacious it should have earned her nothing but ridicule. She insisted that the voices of saints spoke to her in the garden of her father's house. She declared that God himself had chosen her, an illiterate farmer's daughter who had never held a sword, to save the kingdom of France from destruction. By all reasonable measures, Joan of Arc should have lived and died in obscurity, married off to some local boy, bearing children, working the land until her hands were as gnarled as the olive trees that dotted the Lorraine countryside. Instead, she would command armies, crown a king, and change the course of history. Her story would become legend, her name a rallying cry for centuries to come. But legends are born in blood and fire, and Joan's path would lead through both before it ended in ash and martyrdom. This is not a fairy tale. This is the story of a warrior who wore her faith like armor, who heard voices no one else could hear, and who burned brighter than the flames that would eventually consume her. This is the story of how one girl's unshakable conviction shattered the chains of an impossible war, and how the very men she saved would betray her to her death. The war had already devoured a generation. The 100 Years' War, they would call it eventually, though no one living in 1428 knew how much longer the bloodshed would continue. France was fractured, its throne contested, its cities besieged. The English had claimed the French crown, and their armies swept through the countryside like a plague. The great city of Orléans stood on the brink of collapse, and with it, the last hope of French resistance. Into this desperate hour came Joan, with her voices and her visions and her absolute certainty. She would lift the siege of Orléans. She would see the Dauphin crowned at Reims. She would drive the English from France. Everyone thought she was mad. Perhaps she was. Or perhaps madness and genius are merely two names for the same fire, and Joan burned with both. The first time Joan heard the voice, she was 13 years old, standing in her father's garden in Domremy, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of an ordinary summer day. Chickens scratched in the dirt. Her mother sang in the house. The sun pressed down on the village with the heavy warmth that promised a good harvest. Then the light changed. Joan would spend the rest of her life trying to explain that moment to people who would never understand. It wasn't that the sun grew brighter, it was that brightness itself became something different, something alive and aware. The air seemed to shimmer and thicken, and in that impossible radiance, a voice spoke her name. Not a whisper, not a shout, something that bypassed her ears entirely and resonated directly in the hollow of her chest, in the marrow of her bones. Joan, daughter of France, God has chosen you. She dropped to her knees in the cabbage patch, her hands pressed against the earth, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She was terrified. She was exalted. She was 13 years old and utterly unprepared for the presence that filled the garden like water pouring into an empty cup. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I am Michael, Prince of the Heavenly Host. You will save France, Joan. You will crown the true king." She didn't know who the Dauphin was exactly. She knew he was Charles VII, the rightful heir to the French throne, but that throne was contested by the English king, Henry VI. She knew Charles was weak, uncertain, surrounded by advisors who whispered conflicting counsel into his ears. She knew that without divine intervention, France would fall. And she knew that she was the divine intervention. In the spring of 1428, Joan finally told her parents what the voices had revealed. She chose her moment carefully, waiting until after supper, when her father's temper was usually mellowed by food and fatigue. "I need to go to Vaucouleurs. I need to speak with the garrison commander," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Why?" "Because God has called me to save France." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes storms. Her father's face went red, then white, then red again. "What nonsense is this?" "It's not nonsense. The saints have spoken to me. Saint Michael, Saint Catherine." "Enough!" Jacques slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the dishes jump. "I will not have this blasphemy in my house. You will speak no more of this madness. Do you understand? You will marry the boy that your mother and I have chosen for you, and you will put this foolishness out of your head." Joan looked at her father, this man who had raised her, who worked himself to exhaustion to keep his family fed, who loved her in his rough, inarticulate way, and she felt a wave of sorrow wash over her. He would never understand. He lived in a world where girls married and bore children and died in the same village where they were born. He couldn't conceive of a universe where God might speak directly to his daughter and demand she become a warrior. "I'm sorry, Father, but I have to obey God before I obey you." She left the table and went to bed. And 2 days later, without telling anyone, she walked to the house of her uncle, Durand-Laxart, and convinced him to take her to Vaucouleurs.
Robert de Baudricourt was a soldier, not a mystic, and he had no patience for religious ecstatics. When Joan stood before him in his hall and announced that she had been sent by God to save France, he laughed in her face. "Go home, girl," he said, waving her away like an annoying insect. "Your father should beat some sense into you." But Joan didn't leave. She came back the next day and the day after that, always with the same message. God had chosen her to lift the siege of Orléans and see the Dauphin crowned at Reims. She spoke with such conviction, such blazing certainty, that eventually Baudricourt began to wonder if there might be something to her claims. Or perhaps he simply recognized that France was so desperate that even a mad peasant girl was worth the gamble. 2 things changed his mind. First, Joan predicted a French military defeat at Rouvray several days before news of the battle reached Vaucouleurs. Second, and more pragmatically, the people of the town began to rally around her. Soldiers, citizens, even some of Baudricourt's own men looked at this girl and saw something they hadn't seen in years: hope. In February 1429, Baudricourt gave Joan what she asked for: an escort to Chinon, where the Dauphin held court, and permission to travel dressed as a man for safety on the dangerous roads. Joan cut her hair, donned a tunic and hose, and set out for Chinon with 6 soldiers assigned to protect her. She was 17 years old, illiterate, and had never traveled more than a few miles from her home village. But she rode with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going, because heaven itself had drawn her a map. The journey took 11 days through territory controlled by Burgundian and English forces. They traveled mostly at night, avoiding roads, sleeping in ditches when necessary. Joan never complained. She never faltered. When her escorts suggested they turn back, she told them that God would protect them, and somehow, whether by divine providence or sheer luck, they reached Chinon without incident. The real test was yet to come. The Dauphin's court at Chinon was a place of intrigue, ambition, and barely concealed desperation. Charles VII, or the Dauphin as he was still called since he had not yet been properly crowned, was a weak man surrounded by strong-willed advisors who saw Joan as either a tool to be exploited or a threat to be eliminated. When Joan arrived, she was made to wait for days before being granted an audience. When she was finally admitted to the Great Hall, she found herself facing a test designed to expose her as a fraud. Charles had hidden himself among his courtiers, and another man sat on the throne wearing the royal regalia. Joan walked directly to where Charles stood in the crowd. "Gentle Dauphin," she said, bowing before him, "I am Joan the Maid, sent by the King of Heaven to tell you that you will be anointed and crowned in the city of Reims, and that you will be lieutenant of the King of Heaven, who is the King of France." Charles stared at her, his weak chin trembling slightly. "How did you know me?" "My lord showed me," she said simply. She spoke to him privately then, in a conversation whose contents were never fully revealed. Joan claimed she told him something that only he and God could know, something that convinced him of her divine mission. Whatever passed between them, Charles emerged from that meeting ready to take a chance on the Maid of Orléans. But first, his advisors insisted she must be examined by theologians to ensure she was not a heretic or a witch. Joan spent 3 weeks in Poitiers, interrogated by scholars and priests who tried to trip her up with obscure theological questions. She answered them with the plain speech of a peasant and the absolute certainty of someone who spoke directly to God. When one priest demanded she produce a sign to prove her divine mission, Joan replied, "I did not come to Poitiers to give signs, but take me to Orléans, and I will show you the signs for which I am sent." In the end, the theologians could find no fault in her. She was pronounced sincere, devout, and quite possibly divinely inspired. Charles gave her armor, a banner, and command of his armies. The peasant girl from Domremy was now a military commander. All she had to do was the impossible: break the English siege of Orléans and turn the tide of a war that France had been losing for nearly a century.
Orléans, in the spring of 1429, was a city dying by inches. The English had held siege for 7 months, their fortifications ringing the walls like the teeth of a trap, slowly closing. Inside the city, food was scarce, morale was lower, and the French forces were demoralized, fractured, and lacking any coherent strategy. Outside the walls, English commanders prepared for the final assault that would break French resistance once and for all. Into this desperate situation rode Joan, clad in white armor, carrying a banner emblazoned with the image of Christ and the words Jesus Maria. She was 17, inexperienced in warfare, and accompanied by veteran commanders who ranged from skeptical to hostile about taking orders from a peasant girl who claimed to hear voices. She didn't care about their skepticism. The voices had told her she would lift the siege, and she believed them with a faith that bordered on madness, or perhaps transcended it entirely. Joan's first act upon reaching Orléans was to send a letter to the English commanders demanding their surrender. It was a masterpiece of audacity, a teenage girl with no military experience ordering battle-hardened English nobles to leave France or face the wrath of God. The English response was predictable mockery. They called her a cowherd and a whore. They threatened to burn her if she was captured. They laughed at the idea that God would send a peasant girl to defeat them. Joan read their response without emotion and then told her commanders, "We attack tomorrow." The French military leadership, men like Jean d'Alençon,
Jean de Dunois and Etienne de Vignol, known as La Hire, had been fighting this war for years. They were professional soldiers who understood tactics, logistics, and the brutal arithmetic of siege warfare. They looked at Joan and saw a liability, a religious fanatic who would get good men killed with her reckless faith. But Joan had something they lacked, the absolute certainty of someone who believed God was on her side. And somehow, impossibly, she managed to transmit that certainty to the soldiers around her. She didn't lead from the rear like other commanders. She rode at the front of every assault, her white banner visible across the battlefield, her voice cutting through the chaos to urge her men forward. When the soldiers saw her, this girl who should have been home spinning wool, but was instead charging English fortifications with a banner in one hand and a sword at her hip, they found reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. The first assault was on the fortress of Saint-Lô, one of the English strongholds outside Orléans. Joan's commanders planned a careful, methodical attack. Joan had other ideas. She rallied the soldiers with a speech that was more prophecy than strategy. She told them God would deliver victory that day, that the English would fall, that anyone who followed her would be blessed. Then she charged. What followed was chaos, the kind of brutal, bloody chaos that defines medieval warfare. Men hacking at each other with swords and axes, arrows darkening the sky, the screams of the dying mixing with war cries and prayers. Joan rode through it all, as if protected by an invisible shield, her banner never falling, her voice never faltering. Saint-Lô fell in less than 4 hours. The English garrison was slaughtered or captured. Joan's first battle was a stunning victory, and the news spread through Orléans like wildfire. The Maid had delivered on her promise. God was with her. Perhaps France could be saved after all. Over the next week, Joan led assault after assault on the English fortifications. She took the Augustins' fortress. She led the attack on Les Tourelles, the most heavily fortified English position defending the bridge into Orléans. She was wounded during the assault, an English arrow piercing her shoulder, but she tore it out herself, had the wound bandaged, and returned to the fight before her men could lose heart. Her commanders began to believe. These hardened veterans who had seen countless battles and watched France collapse piece by piece looked at this girl and started to think that maybe, just maybe, she really was sent by God. Jean d'Alençon, who became one of her closest allies, later testified, "In matters of war, Joan was most skilled, as much in carrying the lance as in assembling an army or ordering a battle or preparing artillery. Everyone marveled that she acted so wisely and with such foresight in military matters, as if she were a captain who had been waging war for 20 or 30 years. But it wasn't just her tactical skill that inspired the men. It was her faith. When the soldiers faltered, Joan didn't appeal to their courage or their honor. She reminded them they were fighting for God. When they were exhausted, she told them God would give them strength. When they were afraid, she promised them that God had already decided the outcome. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. On May 8, 1429, just 10 days after Joan's arrival, the English abandoned the siege of Orléans and retreated. The city was saved. The impossible had been accomplished, and Joan, the peasant girl who heard voices, was now a national hero. But she wasn't finished.
The voices had told her there was more to do. She needed to take the Dauphin to Reims to be properly crowned. She needed to drive the English from France entirely. She needed to fulfill the mission God had given her, no matter what it cost.
The lifting of the siege transformed Joan from a curious oddity into a symbol. Songs were written about her. Poems celebrated her courage. Common people began to see her as a saint, a divine instrument sent to save France from destruction. The name the Maid of Orléans spread across the country, carrying with it a surge of hope that France hadn't felt in decades. But symbols are dangerous things, and Joan was about to discover just how dangerous. Charles VII was pleased with her success, but hesitant to capitalize on it. His advisors urged caution. Consolidate the gains, negotiate with the English, don't risk everything on the word of a peasant mystic. Joan pushed for action. She wanted to march immediately to Reims, deep in enemy territory, and see Charles crowned properly, so there would be no doubt about his legitimacy. "God wills it," she told the Dauphin, when he hesitated. "We must not waste the grace he has given us." Charles was a man who had spent his entire life being told what to do by stronger personalities. He looked at Joan, this girl who had accomplished in 10 days what his armies couldn't do in 7 months, and he gave her what she asked for. The army would march to Reims. But Joan's military success had made her enemies. The French nobles who had been losing the war for years now had to contend with a peasant girl who outshone them on the battlefield. The clergy, who had spent months examining her theology, now worried about her growing influence with the common people. And the English, humiliated by their defeat at Orléans, wanted nothing more than to capture and destroy the maid who had exposed their armies as mortal after all. Joan rode north, surrounded by admirers and trailed by assassins. She had won her first victory, but the war, both the military campaign and the political intrigue that would eventually destroy her, was far from over. The march to Reims should have been impossible. The route lay through heavily contested territory, controlled by English and Burgundian forces who had every reason to block the French advance. Conventional military wisdom said the army would be cut to pieces before it got halfway to its destination. But Joan's presence did something inexplicable to the dynamics of the war. Cities that should have resisted opened their gates. English garrisons that should have stood their ground retreated instead. It was as if the momentum of her faith created its own reality, bending the ordinary rules of warfare to accommodate the impossible. The French army took Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency in rapid succession. At the Battle of Patay, they routed an English army in a lopsided victory that mirrored the English triumph at Agincourt 15 years earlier. Except this time, the English were the ones being slaughtered as they fled. Joan rode at the front of every engagement, her white armor gleaming, her banner held high. She wept for the English dead because she believed all Christians were children of God. But she didn't hesitate to kill them when they refused to leave France. This was her mission. This was what heaven demanded. By early July, the French army reached Reims. The city opened its gates without a fight, and on July 17, 1429, in the great cathedral where French kings had been crowned for centuries, Joan stood beside Charles VII as he was anointed with holy oil and proclaimed the true king of France. She had done it. A peasant girl from Domremy, guided by voices she couldn't explain, had changed the course of history. France had a king again. The English claim to the throne was broken. The war would continue, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly.
Joan stood in that cathedral with tears streaming down her face, her banner held beside the altar, and she felt for the first time since the voices began a sense of completion. Her mission was accomplished. She had crowned the king. Surely now God would let her go home. But the voices were silent that day, and Joan was about to learn that divine missions don't end when mortals think they should.
After the coronation at Rheims, something changed in Joan. She had accomplished what heaven demanded. The siege was lifted, the king was crowned. The voices that had guided her every step now spoke less frequently, their instructions less clear. For the first time since that day in her father's garden, Joan was uncertain about what came next. She wanted to go home. She wanted to return to Domremy, to see her mother, to trade her armor for the simple clothes of a peasant girl, to let someone else carry the weight of France's salvation. But Charles VII and his advisors had other plans. Joan was too valuable as a symbol, too effective as a military commander, too dangerous to release back into obscurity where she might criticize the court's decisions. So they kept her with the army, and Joan, who had never learned to disobey her voices, didn't know how to refuse her king. The military campaign continued, but it lacked the miraculous quality of the march to Rheims. The French army attempted to take Paris in September 1429, and Joan led the assault with her usual fearless conviction. But this time, God seemed less interested in delivering victory. Joan was wounded again, an arrow through the thigh, and the assault failed. Charles ordered a retreat, and Joan, for the first time, had to accept defeat. She struggled with it in ways that broke something inside her. She had never questioned whether God would deliver victory because the voices had always assured her he would. Now the voices were fading, and Joan was left only with her own mortal courage, which, while considerable, was not enough to stop arrows or change the minds of kings. The months that followed were a slow descent from glory into tragedy. Joan fought in skirmishes, relieved minor sieges, and tried to maintain the momentum she had created. But the French nobility grew jealous of her influence, the clergy grew suspicious of her direct relationship with God that bypassed their ecclesiastical authority, and Charles VII grew tired of being overshadowed by a peasant girl who reminded everyone that she, not he, had saved France. By the spring of 1430, Joan was still a national hero to the common people, but an inconvenience to the powerful. And in the medieval world, inconvenient people had a way of disappearing. On May 23, 1430, Joan was at Compiègne, helping to defend the city against a Burgundian siege. During a skirmish outside the walls, she was surrounded by enemy soldiers. Her companions fled back into the city. Joan fought to the last, refusing to surrender even when it was clear she couldn't escape. A Burgundian archer grabbed her by her surcoat and pulled her from her horse. Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, the girl who had saved France, was captured. The news spread quickly. In England, there was celebration. The witch who had humiliated their armies was finally in custody. In France, there was shock and grief among the common people, but conspicuous silence from Charles VII and his court. They made no effort to ransom Joan. They sent no rescue mission. The king she had crowned abandoned her to her enemies without lifting a finger to save her. The Burgundians sold Joan to the English for 10,000 francs. She was 19 years old, and her captors intended to make an example of her. They would put her on trial, expose her as a heretic and a witch, and then burn her alive to prove her victories came not from God, but from Satan. Joan was moved to Rouen and imprisoned in a tower. She was kept in chains, guarded day and night by English soldiers who were instructed to ensure she couldn't escape or kill herself. The trial that would determine her fate was already being prepared, and everyone involved knew the verdict before the proceedings even began.
The trial of Joan of Arc was a mockery of justice from beginning to end. It was orchestrated by Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a man with close ties to the English crown and personal ambitions that required Joan's destruction. He assembled a court of sympathetic clerics and theologians, all of whom understood that their careers depended on delivering the verdict the English wanted. Joan was interrogated for months. She faced panels of learned men who tried to trap her with questions about theology, about her voices, about whether she believed the church had the authority to judge her claims of divine revelation. They asked her to repent, to admit she had been deceived by demons, to renounce the voices that had guided her. She refused every time. "I trust in God, my Creator, in all things," she told them. "I love Him with all my heart." They asked her if she believed she was in God's grace. It was a trap. Theological tradition held that no mortal could know with certainty they were in God's grace, and claiming such knowledge was heretical pride. If she said yes, she was guilty. If she said no, she admitted her voices might be demonic. Joan's answer became legendary. "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was the response of someone who understood that her judges cared nothing for truth, and that this trial would end only one way. But Joan refused to give them the satisfaction of her surrender. They showed her the instruments of torture and threatened to use them. She told them they could tear her body apart, but they couldn't change what she knew to be true. They brought in theologians to explain why her visions must be demonic. She listened politely, and then told them the voices came from God, and she would trust them over any earthly authority. The trial dragged on for weeks. Joan, who was illiterate and had no legal training, defended herself against some of the most learned men in France. She was exhausted, alone, terrified, and still chained in her cell every night, but she never broke. Finally, worn down by isolation and the threat of immediate execution, Joan signed a partial recantation. She agreed to wear women's clothing again and to submit to the church's authority. In exchange, her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. But the English weren't satisfied with imprisonment. They wanted her dead, and they got their wish through trickery. A few days after her recantation, Joan's guards removed her women's clothing and left only men's clothes in her cell. When she dressed in them, whether by necessity or because she couldn't face the shame of nakedness in front of the soldiers who guarded her, her enemies pounced. She had relapsed into heresy by wearing men's clothing again. The recantation was void. The sentence of death was reinstated. Joan knew what was coming. When Cauchon visited her cell to deliver the news, she told him plainly, "If you were to tear me limb from limb and separate my soul from my body, I would not say anything different. And if I did say anything different, I would always say afterwards that you made me say it by force." On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led to the marketplace in Rouen. A crowd had gathered, thousands of people, some come to jeer, others to mourn, all to witness the execution of the Maid of Orléans. A wooden stake stood in the center of the square, surrounded by bundles of wood ready to be lit. Joan was 19 years old. She had spent 2 years as a military commander, lifted the siege of Orléans, crowned a king, and changed the course of a war that had seemed unwinnable. Now she was about to be burned alive as a heretic. They led her to the stake and chained her to it. She asked for a cross, and an English soldier made one from 2 sticks and gave it to her. She held it against her chest as they lit the kindling. As the flames rose around her, Joan prayed aloud. She called on Jesus and the saints. She forgave her executioners. She asked God to receive her soul. The smoke and flames consumed her quickly. Witnesses later testified that they heard her cry Jesus one final time before the fire silenced her forever. The English commander ordered the executioners to pull back the flames temporarily so the crowd could see her charred body and confirm she was truly dead. They wanted no rumors of miraculous survival. Then they burned her remains twice more to ensure nothing was left but ash, and they dumped what remained into the Seine River so there would be no relics for her followers to venerate. Joan of Arc was gone, but her story was only beginning.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The 25 years between Joan's death and her posthumous retrial were years in which France completed the transformation she had begun. The English grip on French territory weakened progressively, their armies unable to recapture the momentum they had lost at Orléans. The psychological impact of Joan's victories proved more enduring. Wept for the English dead, how she had predicted victories before battles were fought. These stories took on the quality of legend even while the men who told them were still alive. Joan became larger than life, even as her actual life was being deliberately erased by those who had condemned her. The church that had burned her as a heretic now found itself in an awkward position. Common people venerated Joan as a saint, praying to her, attributing miracles to her intercession. Priests found themselves unable to suppress this popular devotion without alienating their congregations. Meanwhile, Charles VII, now secure on his throne, recognized that Joan's condemnation cast a shadow over the legitimacy of his own coronation. Politics and piety converged in the decision to re-examine Joan's trial. Pope Calixtus III authorized the inquiry in 1455, and the proceedings began the following year. It was called a nullification trial. Its purpose was to determine whether the original trial had been conducted fairly or if it had been a corrupt proceeding designed to reach a predetermined verdict. The answer, of course, was obvious to anyone who examined the evidence honestly. But the nullification trial served a purpose beyond simple justice. It allowed the Church to correct what was becoming an increasingly embarrassing error, and it allowed Charles to solidify his legitimacy by association with a martyr rather than a heretic. The testimony collected during the nullification trial provides the most intimate portrait of Joan that survives. Her childhood friends described a pious girl who loved attending church and was kind to the poor. Her military companions described a commander who combined tactical brilliance with genuine compassion. Her enemies, forced to testify under oath, reluctantly admitted that they could find no fault in her behavior or her faith. Isabelle Romee, Joan's mother, traveled to Paris to petition for her daughter's retrial. She was an elderly woman by then, worn down by grief and poverty, but she stood before the ecclesiastical court and demanded justice for her child. Her testimony was simple and devastating. Joan had been a good daughter, a faithful Christian, and a loyal servant of France. She had harmed no one except in righteous war. She had died proclaiming her faith in Christ. How could such a person be a heretic? The court heard testimony about Joan's childhood, her voices, her military career, and her trial. They examined the records of the original proceedings and found them riddled with irregularities. Questions had been asked in bad faith, designed to trap rather than illuminate. Joan had been denied legal counsel. The judges had been biased, many of them in the pay of the English. The verdict had been decided before the trial began. On July 7, 1456, the nullification trial concluded with a declaration that the original verdict was null and void. Joan of Arc was innocent. The judgment that had condemned her was declared to be tainted by fraud, calumny, wickedness, contradictions, and manifest errors of fact and law. Her reputation was restored. Her memory was rehabilitated. But the declaration couldn't return her to life, couldn't give her back the years she should have had, couldn't undo the agony of her death. Justice came 25 years too late.
For the soldiers who had fought with Joan and survived to see her rehabilitation, the nullification trial must have been bittersweet. They had known from the beginning that she was innocent. They had witnessed her courage, her faith, her kindness. They had watched her lead armies to victory against impossible odds. They didn't need a court to tell them she had been wronged. Jean d'Alençon, the duke who had fought alongside Joan and called her a friend, testified at the nullification trial. He was an old man by then, his warrior days behind him, but he spoke of Joan with the reverence of someone describing a saint. He recounted battles they had fought together, strategies she had proposed, moments when her presence had turned potential defeat into victory. She bore herself bravely in all things, he testified. She was simple and young, but her words and deeds were those of someone far wiser and more experienced. La Hire, the rough mercenary commander who had been skeptical of Joan at first, had died years before the retrial, but his words about her survived in other accounts. He had been transformed by knowing her. This brutal soldier who cursed constantly and killed without remorse had learned to pray before battles because Joan insisted on it. After her death, he continued the practice. She had changed him, and he never forgot it. These testimonies reveal something important about Joan's impact. She didn't just win battles, she transformed the people around her. She made cynical soldiers believe in righteousness. She made defeated armies believe in victory. She made a weak king believe he could rule. Her faith was so absolute that it became contagious, spreading to everyone who came near her.
But Joan's rehabilitation also revealed the hypocrisy at the heart of medieval power structures. The same church that had condemned her now declared her a martyr. The same political establishment that had abandoned her now celebrated her memory. Charles VII, who had made no effort to ransom her when she was captured, now posthumously honored the woman who had given him his throne. This pattern would repeat throughout history whenever Joan's story was revisited. Those in power would claim her when it was convenient and distance themselves from her when it was not. She would be held up as a symbol of whatever cause needed a martyr: French nationalism, Catholic devotion, feminine courage, divine revelation, resistance against occupation. Everyone wanted to claim Joan, but few wanted to emulate her. Because emulating Joan meant risking everything for what you believed was right. It meant standing alone against powerful forces that wanted you to submit. It meant potentially dying for your convictions while the people you saved watched without helping. Joan's rehabilitation was just, but it was also convenient. It allowed the church and the crown to associate themselves with her glory without having to acknowledge their role in her destruction. It let them rewrite the narrative so they became the protectors of her memory rather than the architects of her death. The real Joan, the girl who defied authority, who challenged powerful men, who insisted that her relationship with God was direct and needed no ecclesiastical intermediary, that Joan remained dangerous. So the sanitized version was promoted instead. Joan the obedient, Joan the patriot, Joan the martyr who died without questioning those who condemned her. But the historical record preserved the truth for those willing to look. Joan had questioned her judges. She had defied them. She had told them plainly that she trusted God more than she trusted the church. She had refused to recant even under threat of torture. She had reclaimed her visions even when it meant death. The real Joan was inconvenient and radical and unwilling to compromise on matters of conscience. That's what made her extraordinary. That's also what got her killed. The centuries following Joan's rehabilitation saw her legend grow in complexity and contradictions. She became a symbol claimed by Catholics and Protestants alike, by monarchists and Republicans, by feminists and traditionalists.
Each group emphasized different aspects of her story to support their own positions. During the French Revolution, Joan was held up as a patriotic hero who had fought against foreign oppression. The religious aspects of her story were downplayed in favor of her nationalism. During the 19th century, as French national identity coalesced, Joan became the embodiment of French courage and resistance. When France was occupied by Germany during World War II, the resistance invoked Joan's memory as inspiration. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, moved slowly toward recognizing Joan as a saint. In 1909, she was beatified, declared blessed and worthy of veneration. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, she was canonized as Saint Joan of Arc. The church that had burned her as a heretic now prayed to her as a saint. The canonization was controversial in some circles. Critics pointed out the obvious hypocrisy of making a saint out of someone the church had executed. Defenders argued that the canonization was itself an act of justice, a final and complete repudiation of the corrupt trial that had condemned her. Both positions were correct. The canonization was just, and it was hypocritical. It honored her memory and appropriated her legacy. It acknowledged her holiness and conveniently forgot the Church's role in her martyrdom. Joan, who had cared nothing for politics and everything for doing what she believed God commanded, would likely have found the entire debate exhausting. She had never sought recognition or veneration. She had only wanted to save France and then go home. Modern scholars continue to debate various aspects of Joan's life and legacy. Military historians analyze her tactics and try to determine how much of her success was due to strategic brilliance versus psychological impact versus simple luck. Medical experts propose diagnoses for her visions. Feminists debate whether she reinforced or challenged gender roles. Theologians argue about whether her visions were genuine divine revelation or psychological phenomena. These debates miss something essential about Joan. She was a whole person, not a collection of symptoms or symbols. She was brave and stubborn and kind and uncompromising. She was a teenage girl who happened to change history. She heard voices that no one else could hear, and those voices led her to do things no one else could do. Was she mentally ill? Perhaps by modern diagnostic criteria. Was she divinely inspired? Her faith said yes, and her success suggested something extraordinary was at work. Was she simply an exceptional person who channeled her conviction into effective action? Almost certainly. All of these things can be simultaneously true. Joan contained multitudes, and trying to reduce her to a single explanation, saint or psychotic, genius or charlatan, does violence to the complexity of her reality. What we know for certain is this: she lived, she fought, she won, she died. She believed absolutely in her mission, and that belief gave her the courage to accomplish impossible things. She was kind to the poor and merciful to her enemies, and unafraid of death when it came for her. She spoke truth to power even when power had the authority to burn her alive. In an age that values skepticism and irony above faith and conviction, Joan's story challenges us to consider what we believe strongly enough to die for. Most of us will never face that test. Joan faced it at 19 and didn't flinch.
600 years after Joan's death, her story continues to resonate because it touches something fundamental in human experience: the struggle between individual conscience and institutional authority, between faith and power, between courage and caution. Joan's voices told her to do impossible things, and she did them. Her story is one of extraordinary success followed by betrayal
and martyrdom. It's a narrative arc that appears throughout history and literature because it reflects a deep truth about what happens when exceptional individuals challenge the established order. The powerful forgive many things, but they rarely forgive being proven wrong. Joan proved the French nobles wrong when she lifted the siege they couldn't break. She proved the clergy wrong when her relationship with God bypassed their authority. She proved the English wrong when she shattered their military dominance. And for these successes, she was ultimately destroyed by the very people she had helped. This is Joan's most challenging lesson. Doing the right thing doesn't guarantee protection. Following your conscience doesn't ensure justice. Being on the side of angels doesn't prevent you from being burned by those who fear what you represent. But Joan's story doesn't end in despair. Because even though she died, France lived. The mission she believed God gave her was accomplished. The English were driven from French soil. Charles VII ruled as the legitimate king. The impossible became possible because one girl refused to accept that it wasn't. What can Joan's story teach us 6 centuries later, in a world so different from hers that she would barely recognize it? First, that conviction matters. We live in an age of carefully hedged statements, of nuance and qualification, of avoiding strong positions that might offend or alienate. Joan reminds us that sometimes conviction, real, absolute, unshakable conviction, is necessary to change the world. She didn't defeat the English by being reasonable or accommodating. She defeated them by believing utterly that God wanted France to be free and by refusing to entertain any doubt about her mission. This doesn't mean we should all become uncompromising zealots. Joan's conviction was directed toward justice and liberation, not oppression or destruction. But her example suggests that changing entrenched systems requires more than reasonable arguments and incremental reform. Sometimes it requires people willing to bet everything on what they believe is right. Second, Joan teaches us about courage in the face of impossible odds. When she arrived at Orléans, every rational calculation said France had lost. The English were stronger, better supplied, more experienced. Victory seemed impossible. Joan succeeded because she refused to accept impossibility. She looked at the situation and saw not what was likely, but what was necessary. And then she made the necessary happen through sheer force of will. We face our own impossible situations: climate change, inequality, injustice, systems so entrenched they seem immovable. Joan reminds us that impossible is often just another word for difficult and requiring extraordinary commitment. Things that seem impossible remain so only as long as everyone agrees they can't be done. Third, Joan's story teaches us about the cost of speaking truth to power. She could have been diplomatic with the Dauphin, deferent to the clergy, accommodating to the nobles. She could have softened her message, hedged her claims, played the political game. She would have been less effective and possibly lived longer. Instead, she told powerful men what God demanded of them, and she paid for that honesty with her life. This is perhaps Joan's most sobering lesson. Righteousness doesn't guarantee safety, but safety without righteousness isn't worth having. Joan chose integrity over survival, and while that choice led to her death, it also led to her immortality. There's also something profound in Joan's failure to save herself. She saved France, but couldn't save her own life. She crowned a king who abandoned her. She fought alongside men who forgot her when she needed them. This isn't a flaw in her story. It's essential to understanding its meaning. Joan's tragedy reminds us that martyrdom is often the price of transformation. The same qualities that made her an effective leader, her uncompromising faith, her refusal to defer to earthly authority,
Her insistence that she answered to God alone made her dangerous to the established order. She could save France, or she could live in peace, but she couldn't do both. This pattern appears throughout history. Those who challenge injustice effectively often pay with their lives or freedom. Socrates, Jesus, Gandhi, King, and countless others whose names we don't remember. The world breaks those who try to fix it, and then the broken places become strong. Joan's death, like the deaths of other martyrs, accomplished something her life couldn't. She made her immortal and her cause unassailable. The English thought burning Joan would end her influence. Instead, they created a martyr whose memory would inspire resistance for centuries. This is the paradox of martyrdom. Killing the prophet often amplifies their message far beyond what they could accomplish in life.
But we shouldn't romanticize Joan's death or treat martyrdom as something to be sought. Joan didn't want to die. She wanted to save France and go home. She wanted to see her mother again, to return to the simple life she had known before the voices began. Her willingness to die for her mission doesn't mean she desired death. It means she desired to fulfill her purpose more than she desired her own survival. This distinction is crucial. Joan's story isn't an instruction to seek martyrdom. It's a demonstration that some things matter more than our own safety. It's a challenge to identify what we value enough to risk everything for, and then to have the courage to act on that value when the moment comes. For most of us, that moment will never arrive. We won't be called to lead armies or crown kings. We won't hear voices from heaven giving us clear missions. We'll face smaller choices, less dramatic but no less important, whether to speak up when we witness injustice, whether to stand by our principles when it costs us socially or professionally, whether to do the right thing even when no one is watching. Joan's example suggests that these small choices matter, that integrity in ordinary moments builds the capacity for courage in extraordinary ones. She didn't become brave the day she arrived at Vaucouleurs. She became brave over years of choosing to trust the voices, even when they demanded hard things, of doing what she believed was right, even when it was uncomfortable or frightening. Finally, Joan's story teaches us about faith. Not necessarily religious faith, although that was central to her experience, but faith in the sense of trust in something beyond yourself. Joan trusted that her voices came from God and that God would not abandon her. That trust gave her the courage to do impossible things. Modern skepticism makes this kind of faith difficult. We're taught to question everything, to doubt claims of absolute truth, to recognize that certainty is often the mark of dogmatism rather than wisdom. These are valuable lessons, but they can also paralyze us, leaving us unable to commit fully to anything because we can never be completely certain we're right. Joan offers an alternative model. Faith that acts despite uncertainty, commitment that persists despite doubt. She couldn't prove her voices were real. She had no objective evidence that God had chosen her specifically for this mission, but she believed, and she acted on that belief with total commitment. This kind of faith that generates action rather than passive belief, is rare and powerful. It doesn't require certainty about everything. It requires trust in something worth serving, whether that's God or justice or human dignity or any other value larger than ourselves. Joan trusted that saving France mattered enough to risk everything. That trust gave her the courage to attempt the impossible, and her courage made the impossible real. In the end, Joan of Arc remains one of history's most compelling figures because she was authentically, recognizably human, even while accomplishing superhuman things. She was brave, but also frightened. She was confident in her mission, but uncertain about the details. She was kind to the poor, but merciless to those who threatened France. She was faithful until death, but also terrified of the flames. She contained contradictions because all real people contain contradictions. She was a warrior who wept, a peasant who commanded nobles, a girl who led armies, a prisoner who refused to submit. She was everything her society said a woman couldn't be, and she was all of those impossible things at once. Her story endures because it speaks to the possibility of transformation, of nations, of circumstances, and of individuals. Joan herself was transformed from a peasant to a commander to a martyr to a saint. France was transformed from defeated to victorious. The course of European history was transformed by the actions of one teenage girl who refused to accept that her mission was impossible. 600 years later, we remember Joan not because she was perfect, but because she was brave. Not because she lived, but because of how she died. Not because she avoided failure, but because she chose meaning over safety, conviction over comfort, and integrity over survival. The voices she heard have been silent for 6 centuries, but the echo of what she did, of who she was and how she lived and what she stood for, continues to resonate. In every generation, people facing their own impossible circumstances look back to that girl in her white armor, carrying her banner into battle, and they find in her story the courage to attempt their own impossibilities. That is Joan's true legacy. Not the battles she won or the king she crowned, but the enduring reminder that one person, armed with nothing but conviction and courage, can change the world. And sometimes, that's enough.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.